Hello, everybody. Okay, so it is now 6 p.m. Welcome to History Photography with me, ImaniHadden. It's week 8, neo-individualism versus the community versus the media's gaze, and this is the 1990s. So my contact information, ImaniHadden Photography. My Instagram is my first name and last name. My email there at ImaniHaddenPhotography@gmail.com. I'm making myself available for career building and mentorship for high schoolers in the AV area, so that's Lancaster and Palmdale regions. My background, I have a bachelor's of fine arts in photography and a double minor in art history and architecture. I am a professional and public event photographer, real estate photographer, and visual artist. So some general Zoom and Meetup housekeeping rules. Please stay muted with your screens turned off. I'll have questions at the end. You can unmute then. There is no homework, no note-taking required, no testing. Okay. So we're going to start with the technology of the 1990s. On January 1st, 1983 was the official birthday of the internet. It set up new communication protocol for what is considered the transfer control protocol or the internetwork protocol, so the IP address. It allowed different computers to communicate with each other on a network. Previously, computers were on closed circuits. Think like a corporation or a company has a set of computers that talk to each other on a network, but the network was never bigger than one group of computers or one sort of circuit. In 1995 was the year that the internet was launched publicly for commercialized purposes. So pretty much what we are using it today, which is to look at information, get the news, shop, so on and so forth. Internal data computer language was simplified to zeros and ones. That is the binary code. That is how information is transferred all around the world at a click of a mouse. And it started a global network of sharing ideas, concepts, and culture. And so you can get an idea of what this looks like. The under ocean internet cable lines. They are laid on the ocean floor and they connect all the major continents and the intercontinental regions and oceans so that we can have content made elsewhere here in the United States or in the West, and information can then be shared back and forth. So culture in the West, what was being put out there in particular? So in Western values and Western culture, women in the 1990s, more women were entering the workplace. Careers were being put together outside of hospitality, nursing, and teaching. So there are more women in technology, science. And 1992 was called the year of the woman by media. And you see on the right, the Federal Reserve is a source for that graph. You see in the 1990s, there was a slow but steady increase up into the 2000s of the percentage of women in the workplace. So here's an image of a CDC employee working at a computer in 1995. See that boxy 1980s technology carrying over. Wasn't sleek and stylish like we have now. Two businesswomen view the latest stock prices in the NASDAQ in 1997. So yeah, a lot of women were getting into stocks and bonds, stock market, where it was typically dominated by men. Women entered the workplace, so the office. This is a woman in the 1990s answering a phone. Looks like it may be New York or Chicago. And Western culture in the 90s revolving around women, women's fashion. It was the era of the supermodel. We have Kimora Lee Simmons on the far left, Adriana Lima from Brazil in the middle, Imani from Somali. Heidi Klum was German. There's a lot of European models. Tatiana Patitz from Sweden, Kate Moss from Great Britain. These women dominated the airwaves in the 1990s. I put a GIF of Naomi Campbell, who's British female model. The clothing was very scantily clad, very low slung, no back, short. It was the era of the mini skirt and the mini revival from the 60s. We had the original mini skirt. Fashion loops itself back around. We have Yasmin Gori, who is a Canadian model. She was considered one of the most beautiful models of that time. And here she is in the runway and in print ads, considering what she's wearing and how she has a gentleman's head on her lap. It was considered very provocative to have women pose in such a way, more like a powerful reclamation of femininity. She's putting her hand on the guy's face. He can't see anything. She's addressing the audience visually, staring out and selling Valentino parfum. So Gauri speaks out on her Muslim father's Islamic influence on her career.
Then there was her religion.
My parents are German and Pakistani. My father is an imam, which is an Islamic priest. Muslims are not allowed to dance. You're not really supposed to show your skin. Like, you're supposed to be covered. You're supposed to be modest. And all these things are kind of completely the opposite of what I'm doing now.
What she's doing now started when Yasmin was 17 and still.
So it was a quick clip, but it said she started when she was 17, and what she was doing was against her father's culture, religion. And so in the next clip, I'll show you some of the throwback runways of Yasmin Ghauri on the runway. Pay attention to her clothes, pay attention to the way she moves her body. She was very much a professional. However, compared to what her father would have wanted for her, she had completely gone against his Muslim and Islamic views and the influence on her and her culture and her family. All right, so that was Yasmin Ghauri. Her clothing was very much seen in the 1990s, very low neckline or very short, showing the legs, showing various parts of the body. Of course, her head, face, and neck is exposed on the runway, so you can see her makeup and the makeup artist and the hair artist choice in styling her. And that was very much different than what was seen in the Middle East. So let's go forward. So culture outside the West. This is the Middle East generalized. Is a generalization because there are many Middle Eastern countries. They have their various forms of garb and tradition. And so it's just going to give a brief overview of how they did things culturally in the Middle East. So the values in fashion, for women's fashion in particular, they valued modesty. Women veiled their faces, necks, and hair from being seen by men that were not related to them or not married to them. So pretty much in public. They'd be in niqabs, burqas, or the hijab. And men were encouraged to lower their gaze and not stare at women. Very different than the Western culture, in which women were paraded most often nude, semi-nude in the media and in fashion. So here's a full body burqa and a batula, which is a face visor. Very, very, very different than what we are seeing or have seen in the West in the 1990s. So culture before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, that is in Iran. On the 8th of January, 1936, Reza Shah of Iran, or then considered Persia, issued a decree known as the Kas-e-Hijab, literally meaning unveiling, which he forcefully implemented. Many women who were used to wearing the veil at the time either wore the veil or the hijab or the other forms of covering in order to be against Reza Shah, or because they were used to it and the men and their families wanted them to continue on with the tradition. And Reza Shah's vision of modernity was influenced by the Turkish leader Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and included changing what Iranian women wore. So he was very much thinking in the modern times in 1936, which is a surprise. You wouldn't think of the Middle East, particularly Iran, as being aligning themselves in certain ways with the West, but it did happen. So here's women studying at Tehran University in 1977. Yes, 1977, they had no head coverings. These women chose not to. It's surprising if you've seen the cultural outcries of today, how the women are very much covered. But in 1977, that wasn't the case for women going to university, going to school. Window shopping in Tehran in 1977, women of the Middle East and in Tehran loved to buy shoes. Considering most women like to buy shoes or go shopping in some way, shape, or form, it is very surprising to see women without head coverings. They're wearing the fashion of the 1970s at the time. Friday picnic in Tehran, 1976. You see gentlemen lying down and women with the gentleman at a picnic and another gentleman getting out of a car. The women, of course, are not covered. They're wearing 1970s fashion, having a good time. It was very much normal. Hair salon in Tehran, 1977. Women kiss either to greet each other or to say goodbye. There's another lady sitting in the chair waiting to be seen, or maybe she had just been seen. and there's a gentleman inside the women's salon. Actually, there's two gentlemen inside this woman's salon, which is unheard of. Photography was being used at this time to not purposely document, but to keep memories. And now we can see that how times have changed based on the change of rulership. Bodyguards around Shah Raza in 1971. A woman approaches him, and the bodyguards make sure to keep her at a distance. He's a politician. He's the leader of the country. So bodyguards do as they do and keep people that are interested in coming towards the person back. Notice her outfit, very fashionable for the time. Her hair is in an updo. She has sunglasses on the top of her head. Very fashionable, very stylish. Walking down a snowy street in Tehran, 1976. This looks like it could be London, Paris, Dusseldorf, Germany, maybe New York City. Very fashionable with her jewelry, her coat, and her umbrella. What was the Islamic Revolution in Iran? Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was the architect of the Iranian Revolution, and he considered himself the supreme leader, and he established himself in power in 1979. He was anti-modernization that Reza Shah's administration had put together. And he introduced the hijab law, which resulted in the separation of public spaces by gender, women leaving education back to domestic spheres, and mass upheaval of established ways of life, along with the other inter-country issues revolving war, oil, and territory. And the asterisk down below, wearing hijab became obligatory for all Iranian women April of 1983. Since then, all women have been legally obliged to wear hijab in public, even non-Muslims and foreigners visiting Iran. So this man, even today, his rules have had a chokehold on how women, even non-Muslim women and foreigners, have to move within Iran. So culture after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. Women rally against the hijab in 1979 on International Women's Day, March 8th of that year. Thousands of women from all walks of life turned out to protest against the law. 1979, they protested outside the U.S. Embassy, and they took dozens of U.S. Embassy staff hostage, while thousands of anti-U.S. demonstrators surrounded the compound. So some women felt the need to comply while still protesting various elements of political unrest in the country. Family heads to Friday prayers, 1980. By the time this had happened, this had become the cultural norm. Of course, the women can see through the visors and the pieces of cloth over their face. They even are getting young girls, their young daughters, accustomed to the hijab or the burqa in some cases. And men were allowed to wear the normal fashion of the time, and young boys are allowed to wear the fashion of the time, or the cultural garb for events. Wedding dress shopping in Tehran, 1986. The caption for this was very interesting, as even weddings were expected to be separated. I'm not quite sure how weddings and wedding parties were allowed to be separated, but the women in the weddings would wear the wedding dress underneath the other outfit. Sometimes the other outfits were a little bit more decorated, a little bit more glitz and glamour, but the women were still expected to cover up, and people parties were often policed, and at certain times people would pay off the police to turn a blind eye to the mixing parties. They called it mixing parties because men and women would come together and have a party just like how we would in the West, but it could cause legal issues if women and men were seen mixing, and women were seen in public or in the private space without their hijab around men that they were not either related or married to. Caspian Sea Beach in 2005, women are not allowed to wear the bikini. They are expected to be fully dressed. Even this is probably a lot of skin, their calves, but they have their faces out and their heads and hair covered. And this gentleman actually probably came up on the wrong side of the beach. He should be nowhere near these women. And the caption for this on the website said that women and men would often go out far into the sea on boats out of sight from the policing eyes on shore, and they would swim together in the deep water of the ocean where they can commingle and not be fined or jailed. Walking in Tehran in 2005, so young women took to wearing the chador, which is the long dress-like garment with jackets over the top, and a head wrap that partially showed their hair. They began adopting this fashion in order to push back against the hijab laws, because the laws had said to cover their hair, but how much hair, they really pushed that boundary. Pro-hijab rally in Tehran in 2006. More than 25 years after the revolution, women backing the hardliners in the establishment staged their own rallies to protest against what they saw as the authorities' failure to enforce the compulsory hijab law. And you see all these women, and you see this mother or guardian carrying the little girl, and they are getting her accustomed to the hijab by putting a headscarf on her head and around her neck. So there's some people that really did agree with the laws. It's a split faction. Under Reza Shah's laws, there was no compulsory law for them to wear it. It was more up to a choice of the person. Watching football from a Tehran shopping center in 2008. Though women were never officially banned from watching men's sports matches in Iran, they are often refused entry to stadiums, and some of those who have tried have been detained. Before the revolution, women were allowed to attend sporting events. So they are taking Khomeini's laws seriously. No women at public sporting events. So Steve McCurry documents the culture of the other. Steve McCurry went to the Middle East. His work focuses on war and its consequences. He visited war-torn Afghanistan in 1984. He found Sharbat Gula left in a refugee camp. There's various differences on her age, but they said she's between 10 and 14 years old when Steve McCurry took a picture of her. At that time, she was going to be married, and her country was in a very intense issue with other countries around it, as well as early tricklings of the United States into the region. So Steve McCurry is going to talk on his iconic photograph of Sharbat Gula.
Curiosity about this clothes, and it was just incredible how interesting. look at and everything higher. And I think that it's better to be known for one great picture, not covering all possible.
So he has many images from various parts of the world, which were at that time currently war torn, or the issues and the fallout after war. So this man has traveled to the Middle East, Africa, certain parts of Eastern Europe, as well as Central and South America, and certain parts of Asia. So we're going to hear from Gula speaking on the impact of McCurry's image of her.
مشکل سم مخه وه هغه ماجرتوب و پردی وطن و دا سختي وه دویمه دا وه چې خاوند مړ شو په تور زیړي دویمه دا وه درېیمه مشره لور په تور زیړي مړه شوه خپلو پښتنو سره ښه ښایسته ژوند تېر کړی و ښایسته عمر مې تېر کړی 15 کاله مې تېر کړي وو او ما دا تمه نه وه چې حکومت ما سره داسې چل کوي اخره کې ما به زندان ته اچوي خپل وطن ته راغلی یم ډېره خوشحاله یم ولس مشر اشرف غني صاحب او فوزي صاحب او زموږ افغانانو وروڼو ډېر عزت او ډېر قدر عکس چې و مشکل زیات و ګټه یې کمه دومره مشهوره کړم نو قید مو هم کې وکتو ما چې دومره مشهوره یم نور هغه نو زه یم چې د خپل هغه نه دا پیدا واخلم چې ما مشکل تېر شوی او نورو خلکو دې تېر نه شي چې یو خیریه مؤسسه چې خلکو له خیر رسېږي او جوړه کړم او خلکو مفت علاج کړي مخکې خو لکه زه کلیواله وم که نه او هغه د هسې د هغه نه ما نفرتو تصویرونه و د میډیا نه اوس چې دی اوس خوشحاله یم چې دومره عزت او دومره شهرت یې ماله راکړو ما د تصویر نه چې دی لکه افغانستان ډېرو کونډو او ورنډو یتیمانو سره کومکونه و هغه وشو نو اوس خوشحاله یم اوس فخر کوم په خپل تصویر ځکه هغه لس کلنه نجلۍ وه نو ما به خپل سبق ویلی وی او دا د لس کلنې که مو واده نه کولو او وطن کې د سوله راشي د خدای نه دا غواړم چې بیا څوک مهاجر نه شي
So Gula had actually managed to leverage her fame after McCurry went back and other photographers went back in order to find her. She had had a difficult life between the Afghani and Pakistani borders, being a refugee, but in the end, famed Afghan girl finally gets a home. So this was the mid 20 teens, so in around 2015 to 2016. She was found, given the ability to go to Italy for some time while her paperwork and citizenship from the Afghani government could be finalized. Even though she was born in Afghanistan, there was some political issues which she was traveling to the neighboring Pakistani border in order to avoid war and hardship. And the outcome of her fame, Sharbat Gula was greeted by President Ashraf Ghani, who handed her a key to her new apartment and promised her children would have health care and schooling. I welcome her back to the bosom of her motherland, Ghani said in a small ceremony. I've said repeatedly and like to repeat it again that our country is incomplete until we absorb all our refugees. And her name on the deed makes her one of the 17% of Afghani women who have their own homes. So even in the West, that's very common for women to have their own homes, apartments, condos, assets, financial assets, and real estate. It is a slim margin of Afghan women who have that. So they're slowly embracing certain elements of female financial security, but it's still very much traditional that the men is the head of the household, men hold the assets, and culturally that's how they do things. Very different from here in the West. Some would want to argue that they should modernize. Some say that they should be left alone. It really depends on who you talk to and about what. So taking a step back, should Americans and Westerners educate themselves about other countries and cultures? In my opinion, yes. The late Anthony Bourdain had a show on Travel Channel that I came across in 2008 called No Reservations. He's been to every single continent in the world and many American cities, and he is a chef, food critic, or was a chef and food critic, and he advocated for the fair pay of immigrant and migrant workers in New York City, restaurants and other various parts of the food world. So that is my takeaway. I think Americans and Westerners should educate themselves about other countries and cultures. And there's a lot of media online. Even if you don't ever get to travel a day in your life, get on a plane or get in a car, you can virtually go and see these other countries and cultures from the comfort of your home, your living room. There's so much media out there, people traveling. There's YouTube channels about people traveling and experiencing other cultures in other ways. It allows us to understand aspects of how we live and to think about how it is to live in other places and to see how they conduct themselves and their mannerisms and their customs. Okay, so here's my sources. And next week, we're going to be on the last of our series, week 9, creating images today in the age of information. So from 2000 to now. And just so you know, I'm recording all these series and they will be on youtube.com/@ImaniHadden photography. So if you've missed any or if you want to play any back, that's where you will find them. In the history of photography with Imani Hadden, and it's a public playlist. All right, so questions. Questions from anybody?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Let me turn my volume up. I'm sorry, I'm eating, but I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's more of a comment. I noticed when you were focusing on Iran that it was not the women who had an issue with all the photos and that I'm watching. It didn't seem to be the women that had the issues with not being covered. The men, the man or the leader appeared to take it upon himself to want that. So the purpose of documenting that was to show what was the purpose of documenting the history of uncovered for decades. They were not covered. But then all of a sudden they were required to be covered in and around the 90s.
70s, 80s, 90s. The purpose was previously people were just taking pictures to have mementos, and then people, once the regime changed, or the administration rather, I should say, changed, that people went, was there a time when we didn't have to? Yeah, just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, before you guys were born. And people would ask their elders and families to take out the images and show them what this world was like. And so previously, it's just people's family photos, just hanging out, at the salon, at the park, and then it became a comparative analysis once people that were born in the maybe early 80s to 90s are turning back and asking their aunts, grandmothers, mothers, even great grandelders, was this always like this? Why are people upset about having to wear the hijab? Oh yeah, well, before the administration changed, we were just like, well, similar enough to the West. I kind of catch myself as saying just like the West. Nowhere is just like the West. The West is the West, and the Middle East is the Middle East. They have their cultural differences, but you saw the fashions were current to the 1970s and 80s, and it's just surprising that they're now still battling the compulsory hijab law currently. A lot of women are saying we want to return back to schooling. We shouldn't have to be, unless it's our choice, to be put into the domestic sphere solely and wholly. We want to continue what was going on from the 1930s to the early 80s. And so it's the purpose for the documentation is now to show the civil unrest and the rebellion for it, but it's also to show the comparing of the just one generation. It was just so different, and people say that we're reverting back. We're having difficulty with accepting this way of life, and the traditionalists, because there's some women who are traditionalists that say it is the way it is. Reza Shah should have never tried to copy Turkey or other modernizing Middle Eastern regions and countries. He should have stayed traditional. This is what happens when you go back on tradition. You have people not wanting to comply. So it's been a very hard tug, even currently in Iran and certain other parts of the Middle East for that.
Okay, because I guess I was comparing one of your earlier discourses where we started out when we were in the 1800s, moving over into the 1900s, and I didn't notice that tug with the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the women of the middle to the end of the 1800s. I didn't notice that tug as I noticed in Iran when they tried to take them back to something they didn't know. There was the young ladies had an issue, but I didn't notice that coming from the 1800 to the 19. I didn't see that. I didn't see that pushback. You know, when the women of the 1800s, the long skirts and they were all covered up. None of the women that moved forward into the 1900s wanted to go back to that. They did not want to go back to that. So I kind of was comparing those two generations of older women and younger women, where one generation was looking forward to the change from the 1800s to the 1900s. However, the young ladies in Iran didn't want to go back. They kind of wanted to move in the direction of a new era, a new way of dressing, a new way of being women. So I thought that was a really interesting comparison in looking at your earlier discussion of change, and then your now discussion of change in these women using photography to document this change. So what are your thoughts on those change from one generation to the other, almost 100-year difference, and it's so different in the way it's being received and moving forward through a change?
I believe, at least for the West and particularly the United States, is where I had focused, in parts of Europe, it wasn't a law. Like if it was a law to have the women cut their hair, there would have been, anytime you make something a law, I noticed that people are like, wait a minute, I kind of just want to do my own thing, or I want to, some people rebel and they say I want to do the opposite. Just because you're telling me to do something, I want to do the opposite. They become enraged and rebellious. But I find that in the Middle East, because a lot of the women were saying freedom of choice to wear hijab and not wear hijab. We're just talking about hijab, just or burqa or batula or niqab. It's very interesting because the women who wanted to wear it and continued wearing it even through Reza Shah's eras were like, this again? Because there was times when in Reza Shah's administration, they were actively telling women, yeah, take it off. You can take it off. And some women were like, no, this is my choice. And then no one really forced them too badly, because the men of the household or the husbands or the older brothers or just men in the households in general would say, while that's the law to take it off in Reza Shah's administration, we are a Muslim household. I, as the male person in your life, want you to continue to be covered for honor and modesty. And so in Reza Shah's era, the men still had control and said, hey, even though that's a law, it's still pretty lenient and you get the freedom of choice. You get the freedom to choose to wear it. Most women were like, I'm taking it off. I'm good. We're happy. But when we get to Khomeini's administration in 1979, once again, the ladies that had gotten used to not wearing it, or if their mothers had never accustomed them to wearing it, now they're being asked to wear something that they don't want to wear or weren't accustomed to wearing. That's when the backlash came of like, is this guy serious? It's like, okay, not only is he asking us to cover our hair and our heads and our necks and our faces, but now we can't go to parties together. We have different compounds to go hang out. We're segregated by gender on the beaches. It's like, wait a minute, our moms and our grandmas weren't going through that. And the moms and grandmas would say, you know, if this is not something that you like, if this is not something that you want, you know, use your voice. So the elder women were encouraging the younger women in many cases of like, we're past our era, we had our good times, but if you guys want to see change, you guys need to get out there. You guys need to use aspects of social media, public platforms. If you go to school in other places in the world, be an advocate for what the change you want to see. And I don't find that the changes, maybe I'm too westernized, but I don't find that the changes are radical or bad. They want to go to school to become doctors and lawyers and dentists and university teachers. I haven't seen anything that would be considered malignant to Middle Eastern society, but you know, I'm not from there. I wasn't born there, so I'm probably missing certain aspects of Middle Eastern culture of why male leaders even insist on foreigners complying with the regional laws. It's very interesting. Yeah, that was a good question, comparing
Yeah,
the
because I noticed in your commentary that you said that even the women who visit, I remember when Michelle Obama went over into that region, she found herself having to cover. And a lot of the Western wives of presidents and leaders, when they go over to these foreign countries, they have to cover, and they just have to just comply because that's the law of the land. So I find that even the women who are not from those regions are asked to cover, and then the photo sessions documents that. So I think that's a good way even to probably tell the women of those countries to say, hey, even the women who are not from this region, see, here they are, they're in compliance, so you need to be doing that as well. So I think they may even use photos to push compliance with the requirements, using photo for that means to an end. And I thought that's interesting that they would actually use photo to document that, like that room of women in all black. I thought that was really, and then the one child in a colorful head cover. I thought that was an interesting photo.
Yeah, very, very striking imagery.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, anything you found interesting? Anybody else? Okay. I want to go back for a minute. Can I go back? No, I can only go forward. Very strange. Oh, no, I can go back. Okay. So I want to end on this screen. We'll be creating images today in the age of information. So you do not want to miss this one. This is going to be the last one, everybody. So from the year 2000, Y2K, up until this very moment, I'll be talking about it next week, Wednesday on the 14th. All right, everyone. So if there's no more questions or comments, going once, going twice. All right, everyone. I will see you next week.